I'm very pleased to have Marjory here. Like me, she is the executive director of Little Compton Historical Society, and oddly enough, I think we both celebrated our 10-year anniversary, very close to each other. Yes, yes.
Wow.
Marjory has been director for 10 years at Little Compton Historical Society. Little Compton is just a wonderful historical society. They have a fabulous collection, of which I'm extremely jealous. They have some wonderful Westport pieces as well. They also, each year, do really amazing exhibitions. They take on a topic, they do an exhibition, and they also publish a book that relates to whatever theme the exhibition is. And they also have the Wilbur House. Now this theme in particular, slavery in this area, I think is extremely significant. It's something that we know bits and pieces about, particularly as we have done research into the Handy House. We've come across more and more references to slaves in this area. And it's a history that we don't really know much about. And I think Marjory is probably one of the first people to really start digging into some of the primary sources to kind of reveal these stories that we know exist, but we just haven't been able to document. So welcome, Marjory. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are in the middle of a big project at the Historical Society. The title is going to be If Jane Should Want to Be Sold, which is very unusual, and the reason why I've selected it as our title is because when I came across this phrase in Thomas Church's will, it just grabbed me. He owned a woman named Jane, and instead of freeing her in his will, which some people did on occasion, or instead of simply giving her to one of his heirs, he gave Jane the choice of whether she wanted to be sold out of his family into another white family or not. I haven't ever seen anything like that before. It's certainly unique in the Little Compton records, and I think it speaks very clearly to the status of enslaved people. Church recognized that he was dealing with a person who was capable of making this life-changing decision for herself. But she was also clearly being treated as a piece of property. If she chose to stay, terrific. When his 14-year-old son Benjamin turned 21, she was going to be Benjamin's. If she chose to be sold, his executor would dispose of her and purchase another to replace her because her work in the family was too important to do without. So person and property, a theme repeated throughout all the records that we're going to find today. In November, that was all that I knew. I gave a talk in November. That was all that I knew about Jane, just one record. Since then, this wonderful man that I only know online, whose name is Jeffrey Howe, and some of you may know him, has been feeding me out-of-town records regarding Jane. I know so much more about her now that it's just mind-boggling to me what a difference a few records can make. She married a neighboring slave named Prince Bailey. And she married him in Dighton, Massachusetts. I would never in a million years go to Dighton to look for records of Little Compton enslaved people. It wouldn't occur to me. I mean, to drive to Dighton right now, ugh. If you look at it on a map and you see, oh my gosh, we're at one end of the river and they're on the other end of the river, it absolutely makes sense that a family, and they were escaping the attacks of the English during the Revolution, would absolutely end up in Dighton. So Little Compton's enslaved people ended up in Dighton, and if I want to learn more about them, I have to look in the Dighton records. So one document can change a story. You all have more access to these documents than you may think. If they're not in a trunk in your attic, then you may find them when you're researching your ancestors in some distant community. And I think it's just incredibly important that when we find something, we share it. with the communities where it matters so that we can start to tell a complete story. All right, so, and I'm going to be walking back and forth to do the clicking here. So Jenny summed it up beautifully. We have been doing 2 years of research, which is a lot more than we usually do. We're trying to take this really seriously. We will have an exhibit that opens on July 1st with a lovely cocktail party, and I hope many of you will come. We will have a small book, and we can't do a book every year. It's too exhausting. It really is. But this is a good year for a book. And the book is going to be, as much as the records will allow, the personal stories of enslaved people. Lots of public programs, our normal event speakers. We don't normally do speakers, but we're going to try to have a speaker series for this. And we're going to invite school groups to come for free, to come see the exhibit. I am most excited about this because it will live beyond the project. A public database where all the records are accessible to anyone. And our partner in this project is the Pequot Museum. We have 1,000 records. They have 52,000 records. And when those records become accessible to the public from the privacy of your home, it's going to be transformative to the field. We are growing our archive of materials that will be available for people to come see in the future. And once the exhibit is done, the exhibit panels will be able to travel for free to any other public venue that would like to display them. So there is a lot of academic work done on Northern slavery since the 1940s. It's not a very popular, the public doesn't understand that there was Northern slavery, but academics have been really studying it for years. And it takes a long time for that information to filter down to the general public. There is a very well accepted theory that after the Revolution and between the Civil War, the people who mattered in New England, the officials, the people who had power, made a concentrated effort to rewrite history, to create essentially a myth of a free white New England. Everyone in New England was free. Even white indentured servants suddenly disappeared from historical stories. Everyone was this noble, free man, and there were no black faces in New England's 19th century histories. Now, I will give Little Compton's historians, local historians, credit, because they never denied that there was slavery in Little Compton. But they wrote about it in almost a charming way. It was a tangent to the history of great white men. It was very mild. We were so much better than the South. We were so much better than even South Kingston. You know, all of our masters freed their slaves before they had to because they were such great men. And all of the slaves were remarkably intelligent, capable people who were incredibly loyal to their masters. So those are the stories that we were told. And those stories were repeated and repeated and repeated. And in Little Compton, most of those stories came from one book called the Richmond Book, which is a genealogy. It never really was intended as a history book, and the stories in it really are kind of amusing stories that were meant to entertain the grandchildren around the Thanksgiving table, not to impart historical wisdom to future generations. So a few years ago, I took a course, and I had to do a project, and it was a course on slavery, and I said, well, I remember I saw Benjamin Franklin Wilbur's list of 44 Negroes and Indians. I'm going to do my paper on that. I found the list. I started to check his transcriptions, and I just found a few little typos. And I said, oh, well, you know, I know how to find the real record. I'll go back and see what it really said. And I was stunned. I was stunned at the extent of the differences, and I'm going to say intentional differences, between the transcriptions that we had been given as our local history and the real words written in the primary source documents. And so, 19th century histories, early 20th century histories, at least in Little Compton, and again, academics will tell you this is true throughout America, cannot be trusted because the people who wrote them had agendas, and they are very valuable finding aids, but they should only be used as finding aids to lead you back to the original records, and then you read the original records yourself. Do not trust transcriptions, and come to your own conclusions. They're hard to read. A town clerk in the 1900s very kindly transcribed all of our vital records for us. His penmanship is gorgeous. It's so easy to read. He eliminated the word Negro from all of his records. His transcriptions are useless. And you have to go back to the old books. You have to read what was written originally by town clerks who, at the time, in the 1600s and the 1700s, had absolutely no qualms about writing down Negro, Indian, mulatto, and as offensive as those words may be to us today, they give us a clear picture of who was who and what was what, and we can use that truth to move forward. So I started looking, and I found 250 enslaved and forcibly indentured people. So indenture, in the best possible situation, it's an apprenticeship that your parents arrange for you with a good person, and it's like a college education. It's your ticket to success. That happened for a lot of white children. In the worst case scenario, the town that you live in think that your parents cannot take care of you, or you're orphaned, and you have no estate, you have no property, and so the town auctions you off to the lowest bidder who will take you into their home and basically use you as a farmhand or a housekeeper until you're 21 if you're a boy, or 20 or 18 if you're a girl. And that happened to a lot of mixed race and Native American children. And because it's forced, because they had no choice, I feel very comfortable including that when we write about slavery. It was temporary bondage. Our old historians write about one marriage record that they found, and it's, oh, can you believe that these slaves had a marriage record? Isn't that charming? And then you look, and there are actually 9 marriage records, and it's not uncommon for people of color to have a marriage record because it was a white official who married them, and that white official took his job seriously and recorded the marriage. You rarely find birth records, you rarely find death records, but you can find a lot of marriage records. Marjory Bailey is one of my favorite people of color from Little Compton. I love her story. In the transcription, she is a slave, and her mistress gives her to her granddaughter. In the real will, Marjory Bailey is a free black woman, and she is treated like a granddaughter. She is given so much stuff in this will that it's amazing. It's enough to keep her comfortable, without her mistress's continued support. Primus Collins is the most famous enslaved person from Little Compton. He was elected Negro governor of Rhode Island, which was sort of an honorary position. The truth about Primus Collins, he was never a slave in Little Compton. He was a slave in Newport until he was 4. His mother was given his freedom papers, so he was free. He came to Little Compton as an indentured servant. His master did not set him free early. He just was free when his indenture was over. His master did not give him a farm. His master gave him a little quarter-acre bit of land. And then Primus acquired his own farm through his own labor over time. And my margins got messed up, I'm sorry. Primus voted. He was one of the few black men in Rhode Island who voted. Because he was a free man, because he was a property owner, he was allowed to do that. After he did that, the laws changed and black men were no longer allowed to vote. And we celebrate that. We write about that all the time in Little Compton. But if you read the newspaper article from the week that Primus voted, the newspaper reporter is mocking him for voting. So we celebrate it, but in his lifetime, he was ridiculed for it. This is the silliest story that I've encountered. Fred Burley was a slave in North Carolina. Much to my surprise, this is new information to me, a lot of Little Compton men went south after slavery ended in the North and became slave owners in the South, a lot. Some of them returned home and brought their slaves with them, but of course they had to free the slaves. So Fred Burley fell into that category. He lived with the Isaac B. Richmond family for a short time, and the story is that he was going to be the valet for the young son to go to the gold rush in California. The story continues that he's very disloyal. He ran away from the son and met up with an Indian tribe, and they elected him their chief. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's just not going to happen. But that is the story that's been repeated, and it's a funny story, so people love to tell that story. So what is the truth? The truth is if you look in the 1850 census for Little Compton, Fred Burley is working for a neighbor of the Richmonds right around the corner. He may never have even left Little Compton, or if he did, he came back very quickly and continued his work as a farm laborer. Moselle has been my passion project for the last 6 months. Moselle was born in North Carolina to owned by a native of Little Compton. He owned 14 slaves. The most enslaved people owned by anyone that I can find in Little Compton is 5. So for a Little Compton man to own 14 in North Carolina, it's almost triple, the highest amount in Little Compton. This man's name was Arnold Gray. He died unexpectedly, no will. His 7 siblings in the North inherited his 14 slaves. This is in 1857. In 1857, we all think, I am absolutely guilty of this, that everyone in New England was an abolitionist, an avid, passionate abolitionist in 1857. 6 out of his 7 siblings, without any qualms, had those slaves sold and took the $700 for their sale and pocketed the money and went on with their lives. One brother, Willard Gray, agreed at first and then decided, no, it's wrong to sell human beings. I'm going to stop the sale of just my 2 slaves. And he actually paid someone to bring them north and freed them. And Moselle lived with his family for many, many years. And there's this nice little story about her that she got married and moved away. Well, the truth is that when she was about 19 or 20 years old, unmarried, Moselle had a half-white child. And we don't know who the father is. In the worst case scenario, the poor thing was raped by some local person and left to raise her child. In the best case scenario, which is still not great, it was a love match, but it was a match that was not allowed to continue. So either way, the poor thing suffered. And she did leave. She left to go live as a servant in Newport. But her life in Newport was tragic. It was not a happy ending to the story. So for someone to write, oh, she got married and moved away, is just sweeping the truth under the rug. Right, so finally, here I am in Westport talking about all my Little Compton people. Finally, I get to tell you our first, and I think our most wonderful Westport story. So to Nat and Kate, their freedom. That, again, is repeated in numerous books in Little Compton. Sylvester Richmond, great white man, had slaves, but when he died, to Nat and Kate, their freedom. So we're happy for Nat and Kate. We think Sylvester Richmond is this great guy because he's freed his slaves. Hooray. So let me check his will and just see what it really says. Oh, and you know what? I ran out of ink, but I remember. I'll paraphrase. It prints from the back to the front. All the good stuff is in the front, so I don't have my front notes. To Nat and Kate their freedom, if they can raise sufficient funds to post the bond necessary for their freedom, so that the financial burden is not on my son Perez Richmond or my other heirs. And while they're working to raise the money, their time belongs to Perez. If they fail to raise the money, they belong to Perez. They weren't free. They were given permission to be free if they could raise their own freedom bond. That was like £100. That was a lot of money. Nate may have been able to do it. We don't hear any more about him. Kate could not. So this is 1754. 1756, Perez Richmond publishes a runaway notice for Kate. Kate has run away from him. So she did not buy her freedom. She had to go live and work with Perez. He is her new master, and she's not going to take it anymore. So she runs away. And in the notice, he writes that she is of advanced age. So an elderly woman made the choice to run away. Maybe with Nate. I like to make things up. I like to make up nice stories. So maybe with Nate, but I will always tell you if I'm postulating. I will always tell you. Maybe with Nate, and ran away for their freedom. And in his notice, he says, he reminds all of his neighbors, regardless of their race, remember, it is against the law for you to entertain or help other men's servants. If you find Kate, you need to make her come back to me. All right, so the old stories really just don't cut it anymore. It does the enslaved people a tremendous injustice. It does their families a tremendous injustice. And it's not fair to us because it keeps us ignorant of the truth. And so it is time not to forget them, because they clearly teach us how white people thought about enslaved people in the 19th century and the early 20th century. But we've got to move beyond them, and we've got to also give the public true stories based on primary source records. And I am a pretty normal person, average, and I can do this just by being patient and going and sitting and doing this work. Any community can do this, any person can do this if they're patient and are willing to go and look through the records. So we have this shared history of slavery. Nate and Kate are yours as much as they are Little Compton's, and in fact, because her master lived in a coaxit. And in fact, if she was freed and ran away in 1754, 1756, that's not Little Compton anymore. That's so they're yours. And it is this beautiful little teardrop of a coaxit that we share. And white families, black families, Native American families, their history kind of starts with me in Little Compton and then shifts over to you in Westport. But if you want the full story, you have to listen to both sides. So we'll talk about Coaxit families, we'll talk about the Catholic faith, we'll talk about how meaningless borders were to people of all races at that time. You might live in one community and work in another, just as we do today. And then we have this great story about Joseph Grinnell. So Coaxit, and you probably all know this better than I, but poor little Coaxit, it changed all of these times, ending with Westport. And this is the key right here for us, where it switched from Little Compton to Dartmouth. If you were a person of any race, born in 1746, you were born in Little Compton, you could have gotten married in Dartmouth, and then you died in Westport, all in the same house. And your records are everywhere. So the families that I know of, and perhaps some of you know of more, and maybe after the talk you'll be in touch with me to help me. The Butts family had indentured servants. The Brownell family had slaves, and the Richmond family had slaves. And we're starting to learn about them by putting the records together. I really hesitate to tell the story of slavery from the point of view of the white families. I really try to tell the story of slavery from the point of view of the enslaved people. But the sad truth is that these white families are sort of the organizing factor. You know, even if they weren't related, the slaves who worked together had that shared experience. And if you look in the white records, you will see evidence of people of color. So this is a runaway notice from George Brownell. I believe this is truly Little Compton. It's before the change. And his man, Hector, I'll be better up there, I guess. Hector has run away. Hector is 26 years old. The runaway notices, because this is so far beyond ahead of photography, runaway notices are our best opportunity to get a sense of what these people looked like and dressed like. And sometimes because of the shabby nature of their clothing, we can start to really empathize about their condition. There's one from Tiverton where the man has old shoes on and his two pinky toes are frozen off. You know, these are people living in very uncared for conditions. So they're trying to describe him so that you can pick him out from other people. So it talks about his nose and his lips and his white teeth and his long face. And he shows his teeth an awful lot when he talks. Talks about his whole body. If he had any scars, they would have told you where his scars were, and a lot of those scars were punishment scars. Describes his clothing in great detail. The clothing was so expensive it would have been hard for him to change his clothing, so he probably had that on still. And I think this one is, he is very confident and he does not scruple a lie. So they're trying to help you find Hector so he can be returned. When we find these records, these primary source records, just to keep track of them, we're putting them in this really simple Excel database. So here is Sylvia. Sylvia was in a Cooksit, was a person enslaved in a Cooksit. And she's this great example because we have her bill of sale when she was purchased by George Brownell. And I'm sorry, I can't read the dates. They're fuzzy. I'm sure you can't read them too. In 1719, she was purchased in Little Compton, and then George died and gave her to his wife and then later his son in 1756. So she's a Little Compton slave when she's purchased. Without moving, she has become a Dartmouth slave. So the Quakers. So when I started, very naively, Quakers didn't own slaves, right? Quakers hated slavery, so they didn't own slaves. And that's what I started with. So then I learned, I cannot, 2 years, I cannot find a record of a Little Compton Quaker owning a slave. They might be there. Maybe they're not, I don't know, but I have not found a Little Compton Quaker owning a slave. Newport and Dartmouth, very different stories. And I've been thinking of this really as a line from the slave ports of Newport to sort of the escape to freedom in New Bedford. We have this line of Quakers with getting the same direction from London, the same rules and regulations from London, but interpreting them among their congregation in very different ways. Quakers started questioning the virtue of slavery in the very early 1700s, all over the place. And they would actually write in their records, in Newport and in Dartmouth, slavery is bad, we should avoid it, but their members still kept slaves. And the meeting as an institution was not strong enough to get them to stop. And so they started to develop policies regarding slaves. Well, if you're gonna own slaves, bring them to meeting. Well, if you're gonna own slaves, we want you to get married, so this is how we're gonna marry slaves. And again, they would come out and say, slavery is bad, we really don't want you to own slaves. Slavery is bad, we really don't want you to own slaves. But if you're going to, be nice to them. And it's sort of this indulgent parent attitude that as long as you are not violently abusive to your slaves, we're gonna tolerate it. And that continued in Newport right up until 1775, when all of a sudden, for some reason, and I don't know the reason, 19 people manumitted or freed their slaves, all in 1775. And it may have had something to do with revolutionary rhetoric or feeling, but from 1717, they know slavery is bad. But because of the economic benefits of slavery, they allowed it to happen right within their midst until 1775. Now, Dartmouth is questioning slavery very early. 1717, they're questioning slavery, they're encouraging people not to have slaves, and yet there are still slaves in Dartmouth. There's this horrifying story in 1711. It starts a few years earlier with Ebenezer Allen beating an Indian, Jeremiah, and being censored by the meeting for doing that. A few years later, 1711, Abigail Allen is being censored by the women of the meeting because of she has not only allowed but encouraged the whipping and beating of her Negro manservant. His name is not given, and that's really rather common in the records that they don't give the name. And this is brutal, so forgive me. She had the man stripped. She had him hung up by his hands in his master's house and whipped and beaten. Now, she had this done. She didn't do it herself, which meant she probably had another slave do it. And the women of the meeting believe that the reason the man died 3 days later was because of the beating, which I think is pretty obvious. And so they disowned the action as unchristian. And there was another, I can't recall the word and I apologize, but it was an inhuman and unchristian act. They disowned the act and they disowned Abigail. Keep turning the pages. Abigail apologizes, and her apology was very half-hearted, and she's welcomed right back into the fold. Meanwhile, the man is dead. So that's 1711. So when you see the local Quakers questioning slavery in 1717, I have to wonder, was it that act, was it that incident that started the process of soul searching and questioning that took 60 years before it really made a change and people really stopped owning slaves. Quakers really stopped owning slaves. So very different, very different from Quakers don't own slaves. Now, Quakers might not own slaves in Little Compton, because you do realize Little Compton is the most special place on earth. We break all the laws.
That's right. I mean, Westport.
Here I'll have to agree to that. All right, so let's talk about boundaries. These, Newport, Tiverton, Little Compton, Westport, Dartmouth, New Bedford. Boundaries meant nothing. Especially from a Native perspective, there were no boundaries. You lived one place in the summer, you lived one place in the winter, you'd go visit kin. It's, you move. The English, you buy a piece of land, boom, that's yours. You stay there. But even those landowners had sons who weren't going to have any land, who had to move. And the the ocean was their workplace, and they moved wherever the work was. So this is a document, and I know, I mean, it's really hard to read, and I realize you can't read it from here, so you'll have to trust me. This is Lemuel Milk and Paul Cuffey paying a man from Tiverton for all of his work. And at this time, Paul Cuffey is an adult. This document lives at the Rhode Island Historical Society. It's David Lake's account book. And I think David Lake was a native person. He was a day laborer, and he kept just absolutely beautiful accounts of all his work. So this is not surprising that a successful adult Paul Cuffey would hire a native person to come and do day labor for him. So David is from Tiverton. The work is being done in Westport. No surprises here.
Do you mean Native American?
Native American. So this is more surprising. This is earlier. Paul Cuffey is 17 years old. Paul Cuffey is working in, well, the work might have been done in Westport, so I can't say that, but Paul Cuffey is working for one of Rhode Island's largest slave captains, most proficient, prolific slave captains, Nathaniel Briggs of Tiverton. He's loading the boat for him. Now he's 17 years old. When you're 17, you work, right? You do whatever you can. A wealthy man's going to pay you for your work. You do it. And to be very transparent, this particular voyage was not a slave voyage. This was sending provisions to the West Indies, to the slave economy there, right before the Revolution, 1776, and they came back with guns and sugar. But the reason why this is so important is that I think it really demonstrates how interwoven into the daily life of all citizens of southeastern New England slavery was. Even a free black man like Paul Cuffey could not escape contributing in some small way to the slave economies of the Atlantic world. You know, his loading the boat was sending help to a slave owner in the West Indies. Paul probably never even thought about that. He just thought about his work and his pay. But it was unavoidable that your labor somehow touched the slave economy. If you were a woman making cheese and you sold the cheese, it ended up in the West Indies. If you were a farmer salting beef, I just read one of these the other day, your beef ended up on a ship with a Tiverton slave captain. He's sitting off the coast of Africa writing notes back and forth to the Dutch regent of a slave castle. And the Dutch regent wants barrels of beef. So your Tiverton beef, your Westport beef, your Little Compton beef goes right up into that slave castle. You might not know it, but it was happening all around you. It was inescapable. So Joseph Grinnell, and actually, come on. It's okay, we're okay. We might have to end with Joseph Grinnell, but we're okay for now. I might read this just because it's well done, and I don't want to take away from it. Little Compton had a printer named P.F. Little. You can't trust P.F. Little. He was a storyteller. He printed shocking stories. He printed romantic stories. He tried to print histories, but again, you need to take his histories like as a finding aid, pointing you toward the truth, not necessarily the truth. But I love this story. So Joseph Grinnell is a white boy. To give you a sense of who he was, when he was about 5, he stowed away on a ship, a sailing ship, because his dad was on it, and he thought he could go off on an adventure with his dad. And they found him, and they left him with strangers on Long Island because he couldn't come on the voyage. And eventually the little boy made his way back to his family in Little Compton. Then when he was 7, he was indentured. And he was a runaway apprentice. He ran away at least 3 times from different masters because he felt they were mistreating him. And as a white boy, he got away with all these running aways, and he just kept going to a new master, new master, new master. He could have been taken to court, but nobody did. So think about that as you hear this story. He was indentured, and he was a runaway. Now he's about 14 years old. He just had some giant piece of a ship fall on him, and he's injured, and I don't know. He was recuperating for 9 months. So now he's recuperated, and he's walking from New Bedford back to Little Compton to visit his friends. Okay. In returning to Little Compton to visit my friends after the recovery of my wound, just before I arrived at Hicks's Bridge, I met 3 men of color who appeared to be in the greatest possible haste. This is 1784, okay, and that's important. Often looking back as if they were pursued. It was about the time that Massachusetts abolished slavery, and Rhode Island still clinging to the institution of slavery. So again, that's important. We have slaves in Rhode Island, slaves for life in Rhode Island, with no hope of freedom unless, something miraculous happens. And a 5-minute walk away, every black person in Massachusetts has suddenly been made free by a court ruling in 1783. So very tempting, perhaps, to hop over the border. So these 3 men are working really hard to get their way into Massachusetts. And they're there. They're at Hicks Bridge. Joseph knew these men, probably because he had worked in Newport. They were persons I knew, and they belonged to Joseph Easton and his brother. The Eastons were huge in Newport. After a common salutation, they inquired the best and nearest way to New Bedford, for they said they expected they were pursued and wanted to get there as quick as possible, and put themselves under the protecting care of the Quakers. I gave them the nearest route, which was a footpath, and went a short distance to point it out to them, and then bid them to scratch gravel for their lives. And I turned and pursued my journey, and soon came to the bridge and stopped and partook of some refreshments, and again resumed my travels. In rising the hill west of the bridge, I met Samuel Anthony, the High Sheriff from the county of Newport. He inquired where I was from. I told him direct from New Bedford, and then he asked if I had seen 3 Negroes on my way. I told him I saw so many persons I could not distinctly recollect. I must here confess I deviated from the truth to shield the poor creatures.
Yay.
Yes,
Maybe.
that's good. No, that is really good. But we're not always good, right? One person is good 1 minute and then bad the next. So we'll read on. He then informed me that he was in pursuit of 3 runaway slaves belonging to Easton, and that he had run his horse almost all the way from the island, meaning Newport, and the poor animal confirmed in his looks. I had a very nice whalebone whip in my hand I had been given in New Bedford, which he took, although I objected to it, without giving me half its value. I tried hard as I could to detain him, to give the poor devils a good start. Fortunately, the 3 Negroes arrived before Anthony and put themselves in the care and protection of the Quakers. So yay. But listen, so why do you look puzzled? So he made it
I
to New
didn't get what
Bedford.
you said. That's
He made it. The 3 men
They
made it
made
to New
it,
Bedford before the sheriff. They're with the Quakers, so they're safe. So now the sheriff arrives. He finds out their whereabouts, and he presents himself, calls the men by name, Moses, Jack, etc. It says, "You are my prisoners," at the same time bidding them to follow him. And the poor fellows, not knowing any better, were about to obey when the people interfered. And the news had spread like wildfire, and the inhabitants were determined to release them from the sheriff's clutches and from the bonds of slavery. They took the Negroes from him, and then the crowd attacked the horse viciously, and I'm not going to read that part. They tore off the sheriff's coat, and many other annoyances And they allayed their agitated feelings and then bid him make tracks for Rhode Island as fast as the poor beast would carry him. It will here be observed that the sheriff assumed more authority than was legal and more than he was able to control. The assumption of power was in those days too prevalent and a practice too absurd to be tolerated in a land of freedom. So that is a nice story, that this 13, 14-year-old boy really made quite an effort to help these men escape, that this crowd in New Bedford, and they were so violent, it's hard for, and again, P.F. Little lies, so we have to take this with a grain of salt. The crowd in New Bedford was so violent, it's hard for me to believe that they were pork bakers, especially with all the awful things they did to the animal, who is obviously innocent. Why would you do that? But if there's a grain of truth in here, it is that New Bedford was a safe haven for runaway slaves, that Massachusetts became a magnet for people wanting to escape slavery. And when you have Little Compton with slaves for life right over the border of Dartmouth at that time, everybody's free, so tempting to make that escape and just do that little hop and be free. Now, is the sheriff going to come get you? Who knows? But the people of New Bedford, the people of Dartmouth were protecting runaways at this point. And that is a good note to end on, but I'm not going to end there because you turn a few pages in the adventures of Joseph Grinnell, and now he's not 13 and 14 anymore. He's a young man. He's going on 24 sea adventures, and he very, very gladly goes on a slaving voyage. No qualms, no apologies, no nothing. You know, now I'm going on a whaling voyage, now I'm doing this, now I'm doing that. It's all Africa, Havana, West Indies. It's all the enslaved Atlantic world. But all of a sudden, I'm going slaving. No big deal. So as sympathetic as he was, perhaps as a runaway apprentice to these runaway slaves, as more of an adult man several years later, no problem, actively participating in the slave trade. So we're dealing with very complicated times. People are not good, people are not bad, they're very complicated. And the slave trade was so economically important and so pervasive. Slave labor was so pervasive. It was very, very hard to live a life that did not, in some way, become entangled with slavery in southeastern New England and the larger Atlantic world. So we also talk about it in indenture. We also talk about free people of color. I'm starting to go a little long, so I'm going to jump ahead. I would feel badly if I left without sharing this with you. And maybe you all already know this story. This boy's name is Charles Horatio Cuffey. His mother was Lucy Cuffey, an unmarried woman from Westport. In one of the newspaper stories, in one of the later newspaper stories, it announced that the boy's name was not really Cuffey, and they started to call him Hall. And that's why we see Hall over there. I don't know why. I've done all the census records and so forth. Hall could have been his father, but the father's not on any of the records. But he absolutely was the child of Lucy P. Cuffey. An elderly white man, Benjamin Howard, was discovered murdered by his neighbors. The town immediately became suspicious of Charles because Charles had brought $10 to the head store and bought silly things and gave them to his friends. He was arrested, he was brought to New Bedford, and he was held there forever. He never returned home. He was interrogated And after several days of interrogation, he started to confess. And at first, his confession was he witnessed a white boy, whose first name I think was John and his last name was Petty, commit the murder, and then after the murder, he helped John dispose of the body. After more incarceration, more interrogation, the story changed. All of a sudden, the white boy is completely exonerated. Charles, who is about 13 or 14, is now confessing that he did the murder completely by himself. The details are gruesome. It involves dragging the body a long distance. The man was supposed to be very large. Hard to believe that a 13 or 14-year-old boy could accomplish that. The motive was robbery. They wanted the $12 that this man had on his body. Charles was convicted. He was sent to adult prison in Boston, and there he died at the age of 18 of typhoid and maltreatment. So that is a tragic story. This card, this is a carte de visite, it's a photograph on a hard card, was part of the collection of an Adamsville family. They donated their things to us. This was by far the most interesting thing that they donated. So what it tells us is that this was a spectacle. People were very involved and invested in this story. It was in the paper repeatedly. They created these souvenirs and they collected these souvenirs and saved them for 150 years because this boy became a celebrity because of the crime that he was accused of committing. Now, what I found, I'm not expert in this story, and if you know more about it, I'm really asking for help more than anything else. But in our file, there was a printout. This story was recently reviewed by a law school in Boston as part of a...
It really started out at UMass Dartmouth. We put on a symposium, and they were trying to get the governor to commute this whole sentence, because they don't believe that this young man, when looking through the transcripts, was treated properly, that most of the testimony was coming from the police rather than testimony from him. He was not giving any of his, what we would know today as Miranda rights. It was not giving any kind of rights, and he was held without food. His parents were not called. I mean, it was a scam all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
And the white boy had already had previous problems of robbing people as well. So it was more suspicion. The suspicion should have been more on the other side, but because of probably because of race.
Right. So that's interesting. So it started very locally.
Right, very locally.
It was a Boston law school, and the decision of the Boston Law School agrees with what you're saying. Is that
we were celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Superior Court.
Yes.
And I brought this case to their attention that we
Excellent.
ought to do something about it, see if we could clean it up, and that's how it came about.
That's great. That's great. And the decision of the people of
Right.
the review was that
They were trying to get Governor Patrick to, before he left, but unfortunately, timing just wasn't
Yeah.
right. So I don't know whether Baker or anybody there will
Yeah.
do any more with it. But.
And the conclusion was innocent.
Right.
Yeah.
But it was the Lizzie Borden case of its time, in terms of the notoriety.
And so, when we talk about free people of color, we want to make sure we include stories, success stories. Primus Collins in Little Compton, Paul Cuffey in Westport, that's wonderful. But we have to remember that people of color faced extreme prejudice and racism every step of the way. The records tend to be very polite. You don't see bad words in the record. You don't see the N-word in the records. But when you listen to verbal reports, when you look at evidence from the community, you see the bad words, you see the prejudice. And so there is a difference between written, which I'm a huge fan of written, and a difference in oral and community memory. And it's really important, especially as we get closer and closer to modern times, to gather that community memory so that we can see the less polite side of the story too. All right.